Good morning, everyone. Yesterday we had a look at the layouts feature, new feature of Orchard. Another new feature since 1.9 it's a feature of a module called Dynamic Forms, which is a module that leverages layouts and basically it enables you as a user to design your own custom forms in a very simple way using elements, and that's basically the Dynamic Forms module. It adds a bunch of form-specific elements, and it lets you create forms and handle submissions. It extends Orchard by adding a bunch of workflow activities. So to handle the submissions, using workflows, you can then handle the form submissions yourself. So, because it's one thing to set up a form, but then what do you do with the data? That's typically specific to your requirements. So we'll have a look at that as well. I'll just start walking you through some of the basic features of the Dynamic Forms feature. So I set up a little instance of Orchard here. I already enabled the feature. When you enable the Forms feature, it creates a new content type called Form, which consists of a layout part and a title part. It's like a page, but it's just named Form. So the point is you don't need to create a specific type to use forms. You could just create a new page and then add a form element to your page. For example, here, this is just a page. We see a new category called Forms with a few more elements.
Zoom in a little bit. It's a little bit small.
Yeah, so I haven't figured out how to do that using just this keyword.
Control plus?
Control plus? Nope. Oh yeah, I can do that. Maybe a little bit bigger. Is it better?
It's okay. Good. Jump to the... It's more because it's small hair.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. This is control. Is it better?
No,
It's not. Okay. Okay. Yep. Okay, so I just created I'm about to create a new page content item. I'll start by dragging a new element called Form, which is a container, and that will, on the front end, will render the actual form tag. So this is important. And this element requires I'll provide you with a few options you can specify. The name option is important. That will be the name of your form. For this demo, I'll just use a form called Contribute. We'll create a form on the front end, which enables users to contribute content to the site. You can optionally specify custom target URL, which will redirect the form to, or submit your form values to a URL of your choosing, which could be useful in custom applications. I've never used it myself, but it's there if you need it. By default, it will use the post method. It supports client-side validation. By default, it uses jQuery validation, which is extendable by yourself. And later, when we look at extending dynamic forms, we'll also have a look at validation, both server-side as well as client-side. And you can choose to store the submissions. And the way this works, based on the fields of your form, the submissions will show as a list of submissions with the fields as columns. We'll have a look at that as well. So I'm enabling that option. HTML and code will encode the submissions, which is on by default because that's safest. Create content, that's an interesting one. Basically what this enables you to do is when your site users submit a form, you can bind those form fields to properties of your content item. So basically it will, whenever you submit a form, it will create a content item of your choosing and then bind the fields to the parts and fields of your content type. We'll have a look at that as well after. And optionally, you can show a notification, which is easier. You can render a thank you message. You don't have to specify anything. If you leave it empty, it won't show a notification. And then you can, for example, use workflows to use the notify activity, for example, if you wanted to show something to the user upon submission. And then there's a redirect URL. By default, it will stay on the same page, but you can choose another URL if you need to. For example, a thank you page. And actually, that's what we'll do for this demo. So yeah, I think I have, contribute and a thanks URL. So now we have an empty form element, and we can start filling that out with a bunch of input fields, typically the text field. That's a useful one. For example, a title. And the label, that's optional. You don't have to use this. This will render a label by default for you, but there's also a separate label element, so you could choose to display labels in a left column and then input fields on a second column. It's a little bit more work using the designer, but it's there if you need it. This would be title. Here we see the validation tab. And these validation settings, they are specific for each element. So if you would develop your own elements, this screen it's up to you to provide the screen as well. There's a bunch of reusable validators, which we'll look at as well. For example, required, minimum, maximum. Those are reusable. You can optionally show a validation message next to each field, but in this sample, we'll just use the validation summary field here. So we'll put up here. And so we have a title, and let's add a text area. And this would be the body of the article that the site user will contribute. We'll call that body. And we'll make this required as well. And of course, we need a submit button here. Let's leave the name empty. You can specify name, but it's just a form. So I think there's a convention. If you leave it empty, you won't see it appear in the submissions list. And we hit save here. We'll show this on a menu. And publish this page content item after specifying a title, contributes. Yeah, so this is a recent bug I discovered. I think it's a bug in auto route. We'll have to look for that later. So to fix this now, I will have to recreate. We'll create a new page here. Oh, you think? Oh, interesting. Maybe. That's a bug in dynamic forms, yeah, probably. So yeah, so the issue is that because this is a form, it actually renders an input field with that name attribute, which conflicts. Okay, contribute. And the title needs to appear before the body, like that. Yeah, I didn't show you guys yesterday this keyboard shortcuts. What I just did, I showed drag and drop, but there's also full keyboard support to manipulate the elements on the canvas. There's a quick help here, which shows a tooltip with all the useful keyboard shortcuts, including copy-paste, which is useful if you want to move elements from one container to the next. Drag and drop is supported within a container, but not across containers, which is something we would like to add later. But for the time being, you need to rely on copy and paste for that. Okay, so now we have a contribute page on the front end. Oh, I removed the bug removed the home page, which we'll restore here. There you go. So this is how it looks by default. Of course, this is themable. We can make the body a little bit bigger by setting a value for the rows to 10. So this is on the front end. So now users can navigate to this page and submit their articles. You can call this article 1. This is my first contribution. And here's the submit button. Of course, we would have to add a created page because it redirected to the thanks page, which we haven't created. If we go to the back end and have a look at the form submissions menu item, which has been added by the dynamic forms module, we'll see a new entry for the form contribute with 1 submission. And when we drill into that, we see the field names rendered as columns here, and it will take the first 5 or so fields to display the columns. And if you want to see everything, you'll just go into the details page, and then you'll see all the submitted values. And this is stored in Orchard. If you wanted to submit this to other data stores, you could leverage workflows or even handle the submitted event, which is triggered by the forms feature. But let's say that we want to use this input to create content items. For that, we have the bindings. It looks like this. What I just showed here is the content type option, which enables you to create content of a specific content type. For example, blog post. We could have that created. The tricky part with the blog post is it requires a container of type blog. But even with such requirements, you can provide a a solution for that by adding, in this case, what I chose to do as a solution is to create a custom activity which would dynamically assign a configurable block to the blog post being created on the fly. So what I just did, I configured the form to create content items of type blog post, and now because of that, we can configure each field element binding. So this binding step, that will enable you to bind properties of your field. So we just hit edit on the title field. So we'll bind its submitted values to the title part. You can, of course, bind it to any other option here, but it makes sense to bind that to the title part. And the body field, we'll bind that to the body part text property. That's what we see here, the parts listed and their properties. This is implemented using a thing called binding providers. Out of the box, there's a few that come with Orchard. The rest will either implement later, or you can implement them yourself. As you see here, this will show this as well. This is the tags part, which has been created as a sample for this demo. We'll save this first. And as I mentioned, we need to assign the blog container to create blog post content items. So for that, we'll create a workflow. I already created one called assign blog. This is empty. So what we'll do is, oh wait, this is something's here. Yeah. There you go. So what I created here is the content created activity event, which only continues if content items of type blog posts are created, which is done by this binding we just configured. And what we'll do is execute this assign block activity, which will assign this block content item, which I created earlier, to that blog post content item. And this is a custom activity. It's actually very simple. This is a custom module called Orchard Harvest 2015. We have an assign block activity here. And all it does is it provides a form. So it's implementing iForm provider, so that it can describe the form with the little drop-down, enumerating the available blocks, as we see here. So this is the form shape. And here we just iterate over the available blocks using the content manager. So this is more Forms API specific. And this is the activity here, where we just get the selected block by the user and then assign that to the block part property of the blog post. And the context of the workflow executed is the content item being created. So that's how that little thing is solved. So when we save this and go back to our form here, and go back to our blog. Wait a minute, that's probably an error.
Go back to the workflow and set an activity as a start.
Oh, there was no starting activity? Ah, that's what this warning means. Very good. So let's try again. There you go. So this is an actual blog post content item underneath this blog content. So that's a dynamic form bindings in a nutshell. Yeah, there was a question the other day on Coplex about this example actually, and the question was, what if I wanted to bind a tags field to the tags part of the blog post item? And for that to work, you will have to do two things. You will have to create a binding and a custom field. And the text part binding, I'll show that first. And I just explained the bindings provided that enables you as a developer to declare the binding and to what part or what fields you want to bind to. And this sample text part binding is implemented by implementing the iBinding provider interface. And what it has a single method called describe, taking in a context argument. And all it really needs is the text part generic type argument here, text part, and then on that we call the binding method. And this is just a description. This is shown on the front end, and it takes in a function that you implement to copy the posted value from the form into your part in this case. And what we're doing here, we're just using a helper to split the posted values and then assign that to the current tags property of the tags part. And then we injected a tag service to update the tags so that they become available. This is specific to creating tags. It's based on the tags API of the tags module. And the way that works on the editor is as follows. So we go back to our contribute page, and we'll add a text field. Here. And we'll call this tags with a label tags. And then here, we already saw this binding tags. And then hit save. So now when we create a new page, and now we see here, this is the text field we just added. I'll call this orchard, harvest. Submit that. This is my second article. We created a third one here. And then we see that those values have been added to the tags part. And the second part of that question on Coplex was, what if we wanted to use Autocomplete? And for that, you would have to create a custom field that supports Autocomplete. So we just used a simple text field as input, which doesn't support Autocomplete. But creating a custom element is of course possible. It's actually simple to do. I created a text field element here, and all it does, it inherits from labeled form element, which is like an element but with an additional property for the label. Actually, that itself inherits from form elements. So when you start creating your own form elements, best is to inherit from form elements, because it gives you a few more things that's useful for dynamic forms. For example, a value. And a runtime value that's, these are dynamic form-specific things that you potentially need. Things like posted value. So you don't need to deal with those things yourself. That's more to support the infrastructure. So you would just, in this case, all I added was the validation settings for the tags field, which I'll show. So we'll go back to our page. And we'll replace the tags field here. with the text field element here. So this is inherited from this portion here is inherited from the labeled form element class I just showed. So we'll call this tags. The field is also tags. Bindings. This is what we saw here. That's this class. And this is the custom validation, which I'll show you next. This is using the validation API, which comes with the dynamic forms module, and it's implemented as a class tags field validator, which inherits from element validator of type tags field, and it has multiple methods. It has an API where you can leverage existing validations, which are called validators, which is maybe a little bit more advanced, which is useful for reusing validation rules. In this case, it's very specific, so you can just override the onValidate method. And what this validation does, it just checks the inputted tags against the list here, which is like a blacklist of tags. For example, this allowed is an example of a tag that we don't want users to use, to create. We'll create another one, invalid. So this is an example of custom validation for a custom field called tags field. We'll save that. And by the way, that is server-side validation. We don't have a client-side equivalent of that. You would have to leverage the jQuery validation API for that. So we have it looks the same. Oh yeah, the reason we implemented a custom tags field is to support IntelliSense. We don't have any tags yet, so we'll create a few. Actually, we did create orchard and harvest. For some reason, it's not showing the second one. It does show orchard. Let's have a quick look here at the tags section. Harvest. Probably a bug. Anyway, this is the 4th blog post. Okay, so this is an example of a custom field which leverages Autocomplete. Yeah, and that's 2 ways to extend the dynamic forms module, and I think that's it about the module. There's a lot more elements which you'll find in the toolbox. We'll have a quick view. Maybe there's one that I missed that I wanted to show. Content. Oh, this may be interesting. That's the IP address field. This is a sample of a field that doesn't actually submit a value, but it calculates a value at the server side. And in this particular example, leverages the user host address that's provided by ASP.NET, and then you could store that as part of your submission if you wanted to. Individual validation messages, if you want more control over where you display validation next to the elements. Because it's using layouts, you could obviously use grids. That's it. Any questions on what I've shown on this feature?
Yeah. We'd be done by now.
I can repeat your question.
Yeah, just on the all the toolbox on all your elements and stuff down there. Let's say you wanted to implement this for a client, but restrict those elements. You don't want to show half of them, but you still want to have dynamic forms.
Yeah, I've heard that question before. Currently, that's not supported, but could be a nice addition to be able to configure the set of available elements. Yeah, maybe we should think about adding that, but that's currently not. There's no way for that.
When you're posting, you said you could post to like an external URL if you wanted to, for example, an API. Could you pass in a custom authorization header or custom headers on that post?
Interesting. There's no such elements or configuration options for that. You would have to extend it at this point yourself, which is possible. For example, you could implement a custom element which provides those values, and it would be part of the submission. But not as headers, so that's interesting. I would have to think about that. Yeah. Yeah, not at this point. Yeah, I was thinking because you want to control the headers, and there's no option for that at this point. Yeah, would be a nice addition.
Can it work with external data, like connecting a field to a web service and get some values back and put it on the form?
And you mean during initial rendering of the form?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Loading.
totally. Yeah, you would implement a custom element.
Yeah.
You would have events like on displaying, which you could use to call out to your web service, put those values onto the shape, which would then be rendered. So yeah, that's actually more or less what I did with the tags part. I didn't call out to an external service, but I used the tag service to query for the available tags and then render that as a hidden JSON variable. So yeah, totally.
And I guess we can also start some workflows if some conditions are met or something like
Absolutely.
that.
Yeah, there's a form submitted activity which has been added to the workflow toolbox. So you can configure that to listen for particular forms being submitted, and then if a certain form is submitted, you can do all sorts of interesting stuff. Yeah.
Yep. Thanks.
Hi. Do you just have to provide the URL if you want to post to, for example, an MVC controller?
If you want to post to an MVC controller, yeah, you would have to provide the relative URL. So you can't use route values themselves, but you can provide any URL you want, including relative ones. And then the form values will be posted to that controller, and then you can handle it yourself. Yeah.
And for the result, how would I display the result, for example?
The result. You mean the submissions being submitted to the system? How would you display that on the front end?
Let's say I've got a MVC controller and I'm generating some HTML or something or some JSON, and I want to display it back to the user. Or
right. Yeah. So that's an example. You would implement a custom controller where you display the submitted values to the users. This module doesn't provide you with any way to show that on the front end because it can't make any assumptions on what's allowable to show on the front end. Of course, you could bind it to content items and list those content items, as we've seen here, but that's specific to content. In your case, it sounds like it would be specific to your requirements, really. What you can do instead of writing a custom controller to handle the submissions, just listen for the unsubmitted event, read out the posted values, store it in some place, and then you would have a controller that queries that other data source and show that on the front end. But yeah, that involves custom development.
Okay, thank you.
One last question. Can you do validations across fields? I've seen each field has its own validation, but is it possible to do validation on 3 fields, for example?
Depends on the validator. There's, for example, a compare validator for the password field, which has, although it's specific to that field, it accepts a setting called compare with, where you input the name of the other field you want to compare against. It's very similar to the compare data annotation attribute. You could implement cross-field validation, but that will be more custom. There's nothing out of box that enables you to do things like that, except for the password validator or the compare validator.
I guess in the API we get all the values and we can do some custom.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because there's custom, or there's a submit event handler or form submit event handler, something like that, and then that makes available to you all the submitted values, so you can read out any fields you want. Yeah.
Thanks.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you.